Country African boy.
What's up, y'all? I'm Lex-Jordan Ibegbu, and thanks for tuning in to Wahala Talk. Today we have a behemoth in the legal community. We have a general in the Freedom Fighters Army and a newly elected North Carolina Supreme Court Justice, Miss Anita Earls. Thank you so much for being with me today here in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Well, thank you for having me.
Most definitely. So we're going to go ahead and get right on into it. So how do you feel that your upbringing, growing up in Seattle in the West Coast before it was a big city, as some would say, influenced your understanding of civil rights, being that you were able to understand that rights are always transient and in movement?
Well, I think for me, it wasn't so much the fact that I was in a city, but the family that I grew up in that really taught me the importance of civil rights. My father's black, my mother's white, and when they met, it was illegal for them to be married. So that really taught me the importance of the law and the importance of civil rights.
Most definitely. So you've worked with various civil rights organizations. Your career is very stellar. But a lot of times we see that with various civil rights organizations which are associated with bigger institutions, they're sometimes hampered by finances. So I know that you started the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. So was that a bit liberating for you? And also, where do you feel that the Southern Coalition for Social Justice fits in the civil rights pantheon post Black Panthers and post MLK and all of that?
Well, I would say that one of the reasons why I started a new organization to do public interest law, and in particular to do a form of that which we call community lawyering, the real impetus was that we needed to bring together lawyers, but also organizers, researchers, and communications media folks in one organization. And in all the previous settings that I had been in doing civil rights work, we didn't quite have all those tools in one place. And so that's why I started a new organization, was to be able to bring to the communities that I was partnering with all of the tools and the skills that they need to advance their interests.
100%. And continuing the course and looking at your career, so we see that you worked at the Department of Justice, and this was on the sunset of the Clinton years. Now, at the time, the Clinton administration was viewed in a very positive light when it comes to civil rights. As we look in hindsight, some would say that it's somewhat marred. So how do you feel that the work you did doing at the Department of Justice, doing civil rights work under the Clinton administration, how do you view that hindsight 2020, given the full picture?
Well, I would say that it was a very interesting time to be at the Justice Department, the last 2 years of an administration. I was very fortunate to be working as a deputy to Bill Lanley, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and Eric Holder was the Deputy Attorney General at that time. I think that we made some really important policy decisions that have lasted and stood the test of time, if you will. Other things that we did have been reversed by subsequent Justice Departments, and that's just the nature of the beast when you have an administration that switches political parties and switches hands. I was always, when I was in the department, aware of the fact that we had responsibility across the country to enforce the law, and that we needed to take that responsibility seriously. And sometimes it was frustrating to be in a big bureaucracy. I'd never been quite in that kind of setting before. And so part of learning the job was learning how to be effective in a big bureaucracy.
Were things slower than expected? Was it more efficient on the outside, or?
I would say things were slower than expected. I was only there 2.5 years, but there were some things that we had to decide and put in place because of external time limits and time pressures, if you will. So one thing, for example, that has stood the test of time, when I came in, it was right before the Census Bureau for the first time included on the census the ability for people to check more than one box if they were multiracial individuals. And that there was a real question of how those people who did check more than one box would be counted for civil rights enforcement purposes. And so we had to work out a protocol that would be carried out across the government. So whether you were in the Department of Transportation or the Department of Education or any other areas of the government, how would they count? Because all those entities keep data on individuals, and they use census data. So how would people who checked more than one box be counted? And ultimately that was decided by an interagency task force and made a regulation, and that regulation is still in place. So I know that's really in the weeds, and people are like, why does that matter? But I think as more and more youth are mixed race and multiracial, the question of how do we assess fairness and how do we figure out whether a particular policy is having a disparate impact on one racial group or another, we have to know how to what the numbers are.
Yes, the browning of America. So, in one of the cases that you handled in Covington v. North Carolina before the United States Supreme Court, the Supreme Court basically affirmed the lower court, stating that there was racial gerrymandering. So, in your purview, what do you think what image politically and economically could the South become if all of its citizens were able to vote in an equal and fair manner?
Well, I think there are a number of ways in which the system keeps us from having as full a democracy as we could have. And that's why voting rights attorneys continue to work to try to expand access for everyone. Their goal is to make sure that everyone who wants to vote is able to vote, and that all votes are counted equally. And I think we're seeing in Florida and Georgia now, after this 2018 midterm election, we are seeing election officials being challenged in whether they are actually doing that and whether their processes are fair. So I think one of the bigger aspects of this that people may not recognize is that to some degree it just comes down to putting more resources into our electoral machinery, more resources as in money, but also people and technology. And we're seeing a situation where there's real concerns about whether our ballots and our voter registration rolls, for example, are secure or could be tampered with. So there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed to make sure that we have a more fair democracy. But your question was, what would it look like? I think that we would see more viewpoints brought to the table, and we could have fuller discussions about what's possible in our public policy.
I believe that. So you mentioned the governor races in Georgia and Florida. So given the contesting and the recounting of votes at the current moment, are you having an "I told you so" moment, or did you see that this would emanate from something happening like this, having two black figures running for governor?
Well, what I can say is that I worked on the litigation that was filed in Florida by the NAACP in 2000, following the presidential election issues in Florida. So this was a lawsuit filed against the state of Florida. And we certainly learned a lot about the problems that existed then in the state around election administration. I've not done anything more recently. But the other exciting thing from Florida from a voting rights perspective is the citizens adopting a constitutional amendment that gives people with felony convictions the right to vote.
That's monumental.
Yes.
So continuing on that trend, we know that any civil right that is gained has to be continually fought for in order to be pushed forward, and also in order to be sustained. In the recent election, this past week in North Carolina, we saw that although the constitutional amendments were voted down, however, the voting rights, the picture ID was affirmed. So where do you see the fight for voting rights going in the future? Well,
there I think what I can say is that I know that there are people across the state of North Carolina who care about the right to vote, and I look forward to seeing the results of their continued advocacy. When I say people, I just mean ordinary folks who have worked in their communities. All the people who in this past election knocked on doors and sent postcards and made phone calls and met in and had events at their homes. There's all sorts of different ways that people have been engaged in our political process. And I think that's important to stress, because it's not just what happens on election day. It is all that activity in between election days, both to support candidates that you agree with, as well as to hold them accountable. So once they're elected, to stay involved and say, well, we elected you in November, it's now February, what progress are you making on the things that we wanted you to do? So there are, and it really does make a difference who's involved. And so when you opt out, then you're really just sort of just taking yourself and your issues and what matters in your life off the table for policymakers.
100%, I completely agree. So on another note, in the legal field, given the way we look at racially discriminatory policies and practices with strict scrutiny, and the necessity that there be that intent, not just simply an impact, do you feel that to some way that how racial discrimination is viewed in the court system and in the legal field, that it's kind of rigged?
Well, what I would say there is that throughout my campaign, I pointed to the issue of the role of implicit racial bias in our criminal justice system, in our civil justice system, and in our legal doctrine. And I think that's something that we have really good examples of judges here in North Carolina who are working to address that issue, and that is something that's important for us to deal with.
I completely agree. You talked about implicit racial bias. In other instances, you spoke about your brother, and again, my condolences completely. My heart is with you.
Thank you.
So you spoke about them not wanting to convict the killer of your brother, given the race of the killer. And then on the flip side of that, we see thousands of Khalif Browders across the country who are being arrested and convicted for petty crimes and placed in prison, and their life is being completely altered. And one would ask, is that, to change this, is that necessarily a policy initiative? Or some would say that we just need to take over and reform the whole system? Or is that simply the American psyche? But does the American psyche change within one day? I want to ask you, how do you feel about this situation? What do you feel the solution is to that?
I would generally say that everyone, wherever they are, in whatever circumstances they find themselves, can be part of working for greater justice. So I think that it has to happen at a cultural level. It has to happen in our institutions. It has to happen in the legal system. And whether you are an artist or a teacher or a nurse, it really doesn't matter. If you're committed to justice and you see injustices occur in your community, you can find ways to try to make a difference.
Yes, I completely agree. Change starts from the bottom up. So in American history, we see that anytime there's progress from people of color or the lower class, there's always this reaction from those in the upper class or those on the far right, whether it be post-Reconstruction or whether they be post-civil rights 1960s or post the election of Justice Morgan. And you see everything that happened after he was elected. So do you think there will be any pushback after being that you've been recently elected to the North Carolina Supreme Court?
Well, I ran on a platform of the importance of a fair and impartial judiciary and the importance of equal justice under the law. And I believe those concepts had wide support amongst the voters of North Carolina. I'm not going to try to predict what might happen next. All I can promise is my commitment is to do the very best job I can to live up to those principles.
Most definitely walk forward, not backward. In North Carolina, basically, that is the South. I mean, North Carolina is seen as kind of the a state in the South that's different from the other southern states, but that's because of the metropolitan areas that we have. But generally, in North Carolina, it's kind of hard for black candidates to get elected. So, how do you feel? Do you feel that that was were you able to overcome that? Or was it different from you? Were you able to sidestep this issue due to your message or due to the time? How do you feel about that scenario?
Well, there is actually a tradition of African Americans being fairly successful in being elected statewide to judicial positions. So in many ways, I was following in the footsteps of numerous people I admire, whether that's Henry Fry or Patricia Timmons Goodson or Sherry Beasley, Mike Morgan. On the Court of Appeals, we currently have sitting Wanda Bryant. So there are examples of G.K. Butterfield was elected to the. There's a lot of people who have won. A lot of African Americans who have won judicial seats. So in some ways, I think it was the nature of the position I was running for that made it different than, say, the experience that Harvey Gantt or Ken Lewis had when they were running statewide for the U.S. Senate seats. But I do want to point out that things are much better now than they were when I first came to the state in 1988. When I say things, I mean it's specifically the ability of African American candidates and candidates of choice of African American voters, which are not always in this state themselves African American. I would point to Senator Linda Garou in Winston-Salem. She's a white woman, but she was clearly the choice of African American voters, and that she was their preferred candidate. So, and what it matters in our democracy is what the voters want, and it's and so. The reason we sued in the Covington case on behalf of the individual plaintiffs in that case was because the legislature was packing black voters in a very few districts. And one of their justifications was that this was necessary in order to elect black candidates. But in fact, now, after we have new districts in 2018, and we've had new elections under those new districts that were not racially packed, not racially gerrymandered, we saw an increase of 2 in the number of African Americans in the House, and the Senate, the number of people of color stayed the same. We had in Charlotte 1 African American who was defeated by a person who identifies as other. But we didn't lose any. Some people didn't run again, but in terms of absolute numbers and representation of people of color in this state, we actually gained 2 seats in our legislature in districts that were more fair.
That's wonderful. So a lot of candidates who run all over the nation, they gain funding from groups that are out of state. Some will say some groups may be dark money groups. Do you feel it's completely understandable? But do you feel that if there is a high influx of gaining capital from out of state groups and organizations that can pull the candidates' interest from the North Carolina citizenry?
I have not really seen any evidence of that happening in our political life of this state. I think what was good about our elections process in the past for appellate judges was when we had public financing, and that really changed the role of money in elections. That was taken away by the legislature, but and I never had the opportunity. I mean, I never ran under a system of public financing for appellate judicial races, but that's something. I think that was an experiment that succeeded, and we were a leader in the nation when we were doing that.
Most definitely. So when you were running, leading up to when you were running, I would constantly hear a name. It would be like whispers, law students, young lawyers would be like, Anita Earls is running. Anita Earls is, she's, I'm going to go talk to Anita Earls, I hear. So you had like literally my high school counselor canvas for you, to senatorial candidates, to former attorney generals of the country, Eric Holder. And what do you think that was special about what you were saying and you that brought all these different types of people who believed in you and really fought for you in your campaign for North Carolina Supreme Court?
Well, I think I was fortunate to have a career that took me to all different parts of the state. And I worked with communities, so I was partnering with families and communities across the state. So in some ways I had, there were already a lot of people that knew me, and I'd had this amazing opportunity to work at the Justice Department, so to have some national connections as well. So I think it's really a combination of running a positive campaign. That was very important to me, to remain positive, and I wanted people to know why I was running, why I think the courts matter in their lives, and what I hope to accomplish. That was important to let people know, rather than making personal attacks on anyone else who was running. So I think it's a combination of a positive campaign and having broad-based experience in the state that created the phenomenon you're talking about.
I completely agree. As Michelle Obama says, when they go low, we go high. And I think you espoused it, and it panned out for you. Again, I'm very proud of you, and you're an inspiration.
Thank you.
So when you see the negative implications of implicit bias, going back to the implicit bias, and you see how that plays out in healthcare, and that can also play out in the criminal justice system as well as the legal field. You did work training attorneys at the Shriver Center for Racial Justice. What were you teaching them? What were you trying to place within these attorneys? What seeds were you trying to place within them? And what alarmed you about as you were learning from the attorneys you were teaching?
So certainly the courses, a year-long cohort that attorneys participate in, and there have been other attorneys from North Carolina that have participated in the program. And we definitely train lawyers on what implicit bias is, how it operates, and so that they can share that information with clients and communities, as well as it can inform their own practice. We also train them on community lawyering, and what that means and how to carry that out. And it's really, the theory behind the Institute is that you need both a focus on racial justice and a focus on community lawyering in order to be effective in making change for communities.
Completely agree. So, in all honesty, you're a civil rights behemoth. I've said that before, and that's not just in the state. That's in the country, and I really think that career and your resume in that regard, and how you dealt with people helped you become elected. So I feel like you're emanating from the foundation that like a Rosa Parks and Shirley Chisholm and all those Black freedom fighters fought for. So now that you have attained a new position, where do you see yourself within the legal and the civil rights pantheon, and how do you see yourself as pushing the agenda and the morality of this forward?
Well, I think it's a very different role being a judge, and I am dependent on what comes to the court, and my role is to apply the law equally and fairly to everyone. So it's a very different role. What I would say is that I intend to work as hard as I can to do the best job I can. That's what I've always done. And I think that there are other examples of people who have had a career in civil rights and then go on to the bench. And so I will certainly be trying to emulate those folks to the best of my ability. I think we all have to work where and how we can to make a difference. And I decided to run for the court because I just saw how the legislature was trying to take over the judiciary, and that seemed not good for our democracy. That we should have 3 independent branches of government that serve as a check and balance on each other, that's how to protect liberty. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about protecting civil rights, individual freedoms, and liberty, and those things really matter in people's everyday lives.
Most definitely. I believe at this current moment, given the recent election, the election of you and others like you, that North Carolina is being able to stand as a bastion, can begin to stand as a bastion in contrast to that of the federal government, and maybe the federal government can follow suit in the near future. So that's all I have. I know that you're very busy, and it touches my heart that you took the time out to speak to a young attorney who such as myself. I know I'm excited to see what you will do on the court, and even further than that, because I believe you're just hitting your stride. So with that being said, thank you so much for coming.
Well, let me say that I'm here because I believe in you. I think that you are our future, and I want young attorneys, but young people generally, to recognize their own power and to believe in the ability that they have to make a difference.
Most definitely, and each person can make a difference, even if it's only on one person. So with that being said, thank y'all for tuning in to Wahala Talk. I'm Lex-Jordan Ibegbu. This is North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls. She's going to be having a positive impact in bringing balance and morality and honor here to North Carolina. With that being said, y'all have a great day. Much blessings and peace. Until next time.
Country African boy.